and this is our second event this term. And before presenting our speaker today, I would like to also give you some heads up about the events that are coming up. We will have on November 14th a roundtable on Russian politics, on mobilization issues in Russia, with Dr. Ofer Friedman and Vera Mishlin from War Studies. In November, we're going to have on 28th of November a presentation of a book by a book by Tumila Lankina from London School of Economics. And then early in December, we're going to have another book presentation, Messages from Ukraine, a very original graphic novel that was created, collaboration of my colleague Greg Buckenknapp in University of Gothenburg with an illustrator whose name, Estonian illustrator, whose name I couldn't recall right now. But so there are at least 3 events coming up. I hope you have access to news from Russia Institute, and so they will be advertised. That's heads up. But today I am very happy to present or to have with us Dr. Danielle Lussier. She's an associate professor at Grinnell College in the United States. She also chairs the Department of Russian, Central European, and Eurasian Studies. She's right now here in London at a sabbatical, and I think will be teaching in London in the second half of the year, some students from Grinnell College. But Dr. Lussier's research has been on issues of democratization, political participation in Russia, but not only in Russia. Her recent book was published by Cambridge University Press, came out in 2016, was actually on comparing, it was called Constraining Elites, Political Participation in Russia and Eurasia. Indonesia, I'm sorry, in Russia and Indonesia. Tell the title yourself. Yeah.
Constraining Elites in Russia and Indonesia, Political Participation and Regime Survival.
Yes, I was trying to remember it, but too many things in my mind. My apologies. Anyway, but it's I think Danielle will be able to try to connect some findings from her earlier research, obviously on an extremely important topic of constraining elites, because that's the key issue in these countries, and with the situation in Russia today, and with issues of trust and public trust to Russian government. So our normal format is that the presenter takes about 30 to 40 minutes to have a presentation, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A, for your questions, for your engagement. Okay, so Danielle, the first person.
Great, thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. So last week, for those of you who were at the roundtable last week, we were talking a lot about this awareness that we are at an inflection point potentially with Russia's war against Ukraine, that we have seen an intensification in the conflict in the past month and the past several weeks, and don't want to speculate that it's a turning point yet, but sort of recognizing that Putin has really dug in on a particular position, and that support for that position may not be as widespread as previously believed. And similarly, we've seen analyses in recent weeks that, drawing from that, are interested in this question about whether or not we're seeing the beginning of the end of Putin's hold on power. And I don't want to engage in prediction. I'm following the colleagues who spoke last week and saying I don't want to make predictions. But my goal today is really to apply some of the tools from comparative politics and studies of mass behavior in Russia to consider some of the dynamics that we're observing. So by way of an introduction, I'm going to just throw out this question of, is the Russian regime currently stable, or is it unstable? And so some of the indicators that people have been paying attention to recently when they make an argument that we're seeing a destabilization, we're seeing an increase, for example, in more vocalized criticism by elites against the war. We've seen talks within the Russian establishment speaking more critically about how the war is going. We recently saw cultural elite Alla Pugacheva take an anti-war stance. So we're seeing some evidence of this. At the same time, we're also seeing an intensification of the anti-war protests. So in the period from the 5 days following Putin's announcement on September 21st of a partial mobilization, more than 2,400 individuals were arrested for anti-war activities. We've seen more than 17,000 people arrested for anti-war actions, street protests, social media posts, and that sort of thing since the beginning of the war. And we also saw at the end of September that at least 260,000 Russian men left after the announcement of partial mobilization, and we've seen unconfirmed numbers suggesting much higher. So these are the figures that people are pointing to when the information they're pointing to when they talk about the Russian regime becoming less stable. Similarly, we've seen over time that support for the war has gone down. So the slide that's up here now is from the Levada Center, a polling center, and it asks the question, I have it up in Russian, but it asks the question, do you support Russia's military action in Ukraine? And before I explain the slide, I'm going to briefly just make a very quick comment. I'm going to be sharing a lot of data from the Levada Center today. It's all public information. And in doing so, I want to head out sort of a question, anticipated question some of you might have, which is how much should we be trusting public opinion data coming from an autocratic regime? And I think that when we think about that question, there are two pieces that we want to bear in mind. First is how the question is worded. You know, there are some questions that I think are less reliable than others. I'm only going to be showing you questions today that I think are really quite reliably written. And then the second piece is that I would say scholars of political behavior have found through a variety of different techniques trying to get at the robustness of and the validity of these data to suggest that they're a pretty good, pretty accurate representation of public opinion. We might quibble a little bit about some of the fine-grained numbers, but if we're thinking just sort of big picture, I think we're getting a reliable picture. So the blue lines here, for those of you who are not Russian speakers, the blue lines represent support and for the military action in Ukraine, and the orange and the red show lack of support, and the gray numbers at the end are people who said that it was difficult to answer. So even if we just look at this very bluntly, right, and if we were to sort of say, you know, anyone who said this was difficult to answer, that's their way of masking an anti-war position. Back in March, only 20% of the population was taking an anti-war position. At the end of September, it's 30%. So we've seen an increase in dissatisfaction, but it's been on the smaller side. Now I want to juxtapose that with this graph, which is approval ratings of Vladimir Putin. And this goes back, this is Levada data, and it goes back from when Vladimir Putin was first announced as acting prime minister in August 1999. So we see that he has had a very consistently high approval rating. At the end of September, it was at 77%. If you're looking closely at that slide and you see it's kind of a little bit of a dip down, that's a dip down from 83%, right? So we're talking a really small dip. So how do we square this circle, right? We're still seeing this really high approval rating. So my hypothesis, it's not an argument, but this is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that the Russian regime is going to remain stable as long as three conditions hold. And these conditions are that public trust in Vladimir Putin is higher than distrust in him. So if we see trust on balance to be higher than distrust, that's the condition. The second condition is that public trust in Vladimir Putin will be higher than trust in any other political object. And I'm going to speak in a few minutes what I mean about a political object. And then the third condition is that no credible alternative to Vladimir Putin emerges among political, cultural, or economic elite. So my hypothesis is that we are going to see stability as long as these three conditions hold. So how I'm going to walk you through that today. So to outline how to spend the rest of my time with you, I'm going to walk through the logic of this by talking about four things. First, I'm going to talk about what is political trust and why I think it matters. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what political trust in Russia looks like. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the function of trust in stabilizing the Russian regime, and then come back to this question of how unstable is the regime in light of recent events. So first, what is political trust? So trust as an attitude is something that we say is relational. It's not something you just hold unconditionally. It's in relation to a particular object or a particular individual. You trust a particular individual, you trust some type of institution, and in doing so, you are making yourself vulnerable to the fact that that other person or that institution could do something that could potentially harm you. We think about trust as never being unconditional, because if you experience harm as a result of some person or individual that you trust, your trust for that person or institution will decrease as a result. We also think about trust as a belief in the reliability of an individual or an institution to act in a predictable way. And this is a little bit of I would say this is a little bit harder of an idea that I want to try to explain. Often in English, for sure, when we use the word trust, there's sort of a positive connotation that we have with that. We have this positive balance. We think that trusting is a positive thing, that you trust things that have a positive, valuable, normative attachment to them. But another way we might think about trust is that it relates to predictability. That you can trust a particular institution to behave in a predictable manner, even if you don't like what that looks like. So for example, in an authoritarian regime, you might trust the regime if you know, if I behave in this way, that regime is going to predictably repress or engage in some sort of negative behavior to me, right? That can be an example of trust and the predictability or reliability of a particular institution or individual. And the last point I'll make here is just trust is an individual level variable. So what I mean by that is it's something that we measure as individuals. I have a certain level of trust in any particular political or social object. Each of you has a particular level of trust in any given individual or political or social object. But when we aggregate up our trust levels together, that can have a system level impact on our community, on our society, on the world around us. And now I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between political trust and political support. So political scientists, scholars of political behavior often talk about these concepts together. And so just to give you another thought, another thing to think about, when we think about political support, David Easton, who's a scholar who focused a lot on political support, he defined support and described it as a reservoir of goodwill that allows you to make yourself vulnerable. It allows you to tolerate outcomes that you don't like. So that sense of vulnerability, it ties into trust again. We think about having support as saying, okay, I'm going to put some trust in a process or an individual, and it may not like the outcome, but I'm still going to continue to support this. Easton made a very specific distinction between what he called specific support and diffuse support. So when David Easton was talking about specific support, that was generally support for specific individuals. It is support for Liz Truss. It is support for Boris Johnson. It is support for Vladimir Putin. It's support for Donald Trump, specific individual. Whereas diffuse support is support for more abstract, or what I'm going to call faceless political objects. So that could be support for the parliament in general, support for prime minister in general, support for the presidency as an institution, support in elections, right? We could think about elections as an institution, right? Do you support them? Do you have a belief that you're going to trust the process of an election, even if the person that you voted for lost? One of the things that we know from studies of political support in advanced democracies is that citizens who've lived in countries that have been democratic for very long periods of time actually do a really good job of distinguishing between specific objects, specific individuals, and these abstract institutions. So your average citizen of the United Kingdom, they can make a distinction between Liz Truss versus the prime minister as an executive. Citizens of the United States can make a difference between how much they support Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Barack Obama versus the presidency as an executive institution. However, we know a lot less about what political support looks like in non-democratic contexts. There are simply fewer studies that have tried to tease that out and look at it. But I think that nevertheless, there's some interesting things that we can think about that help us to understand the way that trust and support are related in authoritarian regimes. So we can think about political trust developing in authoritarian regimes in a way that can strengthen that. And I have 3 examples on this slide here, ways that we can think about this. So one is that trust in specific individuals can undermine the development of trust in institutions that hold elites accountable. So if I go back to that example I just talked about a minute ago, how citizens in advanced democracies can separate out their support for specific office holders versus institutions. In political context where you don't have a long-standing history of democracy, so like Russia, if you have really high levels of trust in a specific individual, in this case, Vladimir Putin, that trust in Vladimir Putin could undermine the development of trust in these more faceless or abstract institutions. In my book, I find evidence of this, right? That trust, high levels of trust in Putin as an individual in the early noughts is a very strong predictor. It helps to create this reservoir of goodwill for Putin while he used his constituted authority to remove the very nascent nascent institutions that existed that were attempts at democracy or attempts at least at elite accountability. So a second feature, a second way that political trust can develop and why it's significant to think about in authoritarian contexts is that high levels of trust in the predictable behavior of authoritarian institutions can be conducive to self-discipline and self-censorship. And again, Russia's a really good example, and I would say the institution of the Russian media is a great example of this, where we see that because there's such restrictive laws in what the media can do and how they can report, they're very selective in the types of stories they try to report, and they're very selective in the language that they use. So they engage in some self-censorship as a result. Well, then consequently, certain stories don't get reported, certain positions don't get reported, and therefore fewer ideas are present in the system. And as a result, this helps to strengthen the authoritarian narrative of what politics looks like. And as a third example of how we can see this, trust, just in general, political trust, is thought to foster behavioral compliance with government commands. So if you have more trust in your political machine, you're going to do things. You're going, and sort of the two big metrics that are frequently used cross-nationally to think about this has to do with 2 things that people never want to do, but they do because it's important for the state, right? And the first one's paying taxes, right? No one wants to pay taxes. But if you trust that process, you pay your taxes. You're more likely to, right? Another one is compliance with the draft, right? If you trust in your political regime, you're more likely to comply with being drafted to the army. So these types of things they're present in democracies and in non-democratic contexts as well. So what does political trust look like in Russia? So I have here, and I'm going to walk through some of the findings from my book. When I have a chapter in my book that looks at trust. And just to provide some background context on this, the analysis that I'm sharing with you is based on an analysis of public opinion surveys over time, going back to the 1990s, and open-ended interviews with a representative sample of 50 Russian citizens. So it's qualitative and quantitative context. So just to highlight some of my findings from looking at political trust in Russia using these different forms of data, I found that most Russians were not able to distinguish specific office holders from those faceless institutions in the way that citizens in advanced democracies do. So if you ask a Russian citizen about their trust in, let's say, the presidency or in the Duma, they're going to answer that bearing in mind the current occupant of those offices and not think about that, the broader institutions. But I also found that if you're engaging in a dialogue and talking to citizens about trust, and if they are able to make that distinction, they tend to have much higher trust in specific individuals than in the faceless institution. Another finding I had is that citizens' evaluations of leaders' performance strongly correlates with how they view trust. So if they think that a political leader has performed well, if they're satisfied with their performance, they tend to view that individual as trustworthy. Similarly, if they think that a leader has performed poorly, and the paradigmatic example that came up over and over again in my research was Boris Yeltsin, for example, then they don't think he's a trustworthy individual, or he's trustworthy. I also found that political trust serves as a really strong predictor of Russian political participation. And I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. But the key piece that I want to emphasize here is that this is not a simple situation where more trust, higher levels of trust, means more political participation. Rather, the political objects that Russians trust plays a role in predicting what type of political participation they engage in. So it's a qualitative difference and not just a quantitative one. And the last sort of finding I have here is that Putin has enjoyed a very high level of political trust over time. So if we think back to that early slide that I showed you of the approval rating, again, with support and approval correlating really strongly with trust, we see that's actually a fairly good predictor here in that particular instance. But I want to now share with you some other evidence or some other ways we might look at political trust in Russia. So here's a slide. Again, this is Levada Center data that looks at political trust over time. And the way that this question was asked, this was a question that was asked to look at diffuse support. So the question in Russian is asked, to what extent, in your opinion, are these different objects worthy of trust? And that red line is the president. That's the only one that I translated on here. The others are other political objects. The black line is the government. There are lines for the Duma, the Federation Council, political parties, local leaders, etc. But the key point I want you to think about here is what I just said a moment ago, where if a Russian citizen is asked a question like this, they're thinking about who's holding office, right? So this data point, the very beginning of it is from September of 2000, of the red line. So it was, the very tail end of Boris Yeltsin's presidency. So otherwise, with the exception of the 4 years when Dmitry Medvedev was in office, we can think about this as trust in Putin. And it's dipped and gone up and down. The lowest point is in October of 2011. Dmitry Medvedev was president at that time. And for those of you who may remember, that was immediately after Putin announced that he was going to return to the presidency and run for a third term of office. So trust in the presidency was at its absolute lowest when that announcement was made. The peaks, the very highest, is in 2014, shortly after the seizure of Crimea. And then we have actually August of 2022, an 80% trust level. Now, a different way you can ask this question, so this is a closed-ended question. Another way you can ask this question, I think this is an interesting method, is an open-ended question. And here's again Levada Center data, and they ask, name several politicians or political figures who you trust the most. So respondents were asked to just name figures they trusted the most. And this is a shorter time span that I have on this, that is on this graph, just from December of 2021 to January of 2022. But we see Putin has the highest, his name is offered more frequently than anyone else by approximately Sergei Shoigu, and he's a distant second here, right? 11 to 12%. Other names on here, Zhirinovsky, this was before he died, less than 10%. Navalny has less than 4%, right? So these are really low numbers. Now, I was interested in looking at how much has that changed over time, and I was able to find some other data from the Levada Center, and I graphed this out. Name several individuals that you trust, and the data goes from November of 2017 through June of 2021. So that's the time span. And what I graphed here is Putin. He's the blue line. I graphed Shoigu because he was in second, and he's the orange line. And then I graphed two other open-ended responses. The gray line is I don't trust anyone, and the yellow line is difficult to say, don't know. And I think there's some really interesting things that happen in this graph. So we see that in November of 2017, almost 60% of people who were asked this question volunteered Vladimir Putin's name. And by June 2021, it's down to 33%. And notice, the other piece I'll just notice is how slowly that gray line has creeped up. And if we take that gray line of I don't trust anyone, and if we take that yellow line that says I don't know, it's difficult to answer, those two combined are 38% of respondents. So, about a third of the people volunteer Putin's name, and about a third of the people, a little bit more than a third of the people say, I don't know who to trust, or I can't answer this question. It's too difficult for me to answer this question. Now I want to talk about what function trust serves in the Russian regime. And as I mentioned earlier, trust is a really strong predictor of political participation and what I would call patterns of political participation that I argue have an impact on regime stability. So I'm going to, and I apologize that I'm just throwing a lot of new political science concepts at people, but I'm going to throw one more into right now. So in my analysis of political participation, I make the argument that most forms of political participation outside of voting, right? Voting is the most common form of political participation out there, and I'm really interested in looking at forms other than voting. So what I call non-voting participation. Most of it can be divided into two categories. It's either elite constraining political participation or it's elite innate. So elite constraining participation, it impedes leaders from overstepping their constituted authority or hinders them from undertaking unpopular policy decisions by inserting competition and accountability into the system, right? So examples of elite constraining participation include building political parties, campaigning for opposition candidates, engaging in active contentious politics. These are all ways that it forces existing leaders to hold themselves to be held accountable in a very public manner. Elite enabling political participation, in contrast, is it empowers leaders to strengthen either their formal or their informal authority by building loyalty among constituents. And often what elite enabling participation does is it moves conflict out of the public sphere into a private relationship between a political elite and their constituents. So two examples of this are contacting public officials for constituent services. So it could be contacting them with a question, it could be complaining about something, but that is one example of a form of elite enablement. Another is political support, supporting the incumbent party chief. Now, one of the things that I have found is that if we think about political participation and the types of political participation that Russian citizens tend to engage in, they have a very strong preference for elite enabling forms of political participation. Why is this important? This is important because between elections happen at regular intervals, right? 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, something like that. But between elections, that's when political elites can change the rules of the game to determine whether or not elections become more or less competitive. So it's in between elections that it matters whether or not you have a population that is trying to constrain political elites or is enabling them. And so Russians, as I said, they have a strong preference for elite enabling participation. Very concretely, they have a strong preference for contacting public officials. So I want to talk a little bit about that now. This is a long-standing tradition, so any of you who are knowledgeable about Russian history are familiar with this practice. It dates back to the Muscovite era of petitioning the benevolent Tsar. You know, we had individuals who felt as if they had been wronged in the empire, they petitioned the Tsar. This tradition of citizen appeals evolved under the Soviet regime in the 20th century, became sort of a more formalized process of collecting and aggregating and encouraging people to write complaints in order to have their social benefits adequately distributed. In the 21st century, I found that Russian citizens choose to contact public officials as a mode of political engagement because they view this as a more effective way to resolve their problems than engaging in either contentious political acts or electoral channels, right? They think this is going to be more effective. In my research also, I found that citizens, who engage in this type of political engagement, they don't view it as political. They see this as concerning a private matter. And the last point I'll just make is that this practice of contacting public officials in Russia, it has allowed the Russian state to monitor performance of lower levels of the administration. So more specifically, in 2006, there was a federal law on the procedures for considering citizen appeals that was passed. And what this law did was it provided a regulatory framework for what to do if a citizen submits an appeal. And by appeal, there's sort of very concrete idea behind this. This is a question, a complaint, or a suggestion. And any one of these that's issued, there's a law behind this now. It has to be given a number. It has to be put through a process where it gets tracked. it deserves a reply. If the citizen doesn't receive a reply in a particular amount of time, it gets kicked up to a higher, the citizen has the right to appeal to a higher authority. What this has done is it's been an information gathering opportunity for various levels of the government. So what can happen is that if we just sort of take a very basic example at the federal level, if they're seeing that complaints are coming in about some particular policy, they can make a policy adjustment behind the scenes to address those complaints, satisfy the constituents without creating sort of a public spectacle about it. Alternately, if they're seeing that a large number of complaints are coming in from a particular geographic region, they can change the personnel of that region. And in so doing, they satisfy the population who has been complaining and also show themselves to be that they're being accountable, that they're actually holding elites accountable. So I want to share now a few examples of how we see the data look on this. So this is data again from the Levada Center, and they asked this question: how ready are you to participate in various civic activities? So the orange line is not ready and the blue line is ready. So the bottom, and here we have vote in elections. You know, more than 60% of Russians are ready to vote in elections. That's to be expected. If we look at the two lines above that, those are both examples of contacting public officials, right? So signing an open letter or petition or appealing to organs of executive power. And in both of those cases, we see that more than 40% of the population is ready to engage in this type of behavior. Whereas if we look at the top of the chart, you know, putting yourself forward as a candidate, we've got 5% expressing willingness to this, so willingness to engage in that electoral channel, and about 20% being willing to participate in street actions or protests. So for so one way of thinking about this is that twice as many people are willing to contact public officials than are willing to go out and protest in the streets. Now this question is asking about, are you willing to do this? Are you ready to do this? This other question asks, have you done it? So in the past 12 months, have you? And before I talk about the specific numbers, I want to throw this idea out there. So lots of people cross-nationally vote. Engagement in other forms of political participation, non-voting political participation, is generally low, right? Now, this is an across-the-board issue in all countries. So I don't want us to be focusing on the low numbers. I want us to be focusing on the relative differences across different modes of participation. But I will say, even cross-nationally, participation in non-voting political acts is lower in Russia than it is in many other cases. But if we look at this, we see that 4% of the population, this was from April 2021, and the past year had participated in a street protest. In contrast, 13% had signed a collective appeal or petition, and 17% had appealed to state orders with a question, complaint, or statement. So again, twice as many people, or 3 times as many people, are engaging in contacting over forms of protest or contentious politics. Okay, so this data here aggregates the overall number of appeals that the president of the Russian Federation has received over time. So as I mentioned, there's this law that has resulted in an enormous amount of record keeping and reporting on the types of appeals that are received. Now, most of this reporting is private. It's not public. But the Kremlin publishes their sort of a basic report of the appeals that the president receives going back from 2009. So I wrapped this here through 2021, and you know, see variation over time. High point was in 2015, Putin received over 1 million appeals. In 2021, he received over 800,000. And the point that I want to make here is that this is for one office, right? This is the president's appeals. This is not including anyone who's appealing to a governor, a local authority, a member of an assembly. Protest data is notoriously hard to gather. I don't think we will ever have an accurate number of people who have engaged in the political protest. And if anything, the numbers that we have are probably undercounts because they're not picking up smaller protests. But we've never seen anything close to these types of numbers in terms of we were going to try to compare how people are engaging, right? Are they writing a letter or are they going out to the street? So I was interested in knowing what I know about presidential appeals. I was interested in trying to see whether or not there's been any change in appeals since the war began. And so what I did here is I just graphed out month to month Putin's appeals for February through September for 2021 and 2022. And in fact, I kind of don't even know why I'm showing you this graph, because I just wanted to prove to you that we don't see any change. I mean, there's nothing, right? If anything, we have fewer appeals in 2022 than we have in 2021. So we're not seeing the number of appeals increase. However, in April of 2022 and September 2022, in the short report that the Kremlin issues about their appeals, they noted that there was an increase of appeals on the theme of defense, national security, and legality. They don't tell you numbers, right? They don't tell me how many numbers, how many appeals were on the theme. But they said over the last period, which in this case means month, there has been an increase in this number. So let's start with the fact that in April, it increased over March. So then the next month in May, if it's at the same level that it was in March, it wouldn't be reported as an increase. Okay, so we saw an increase in April, and then it's steady, steady, steady until August. And then we see an increase again in August. So to me, that's some evidence that individuals are using this appeal process to express their views about the war, positive or negative or suggestions, right? That they're using this process to work through their views about it. So to conclude, I'm going to come back to the question I started with, is the Russian regime unstable? And my hypothesis, and just sort of evaluate where we are right now. So I started off saying that I hypothesize that the Russian regime will remain stable if three conditions hold. The first one, public trust in Vladimir Putin, is higher than distrust in him. Now, I think that the evidence is telling us that Putin's approval rate, his approval rating remains very high. That graph I showed you about trust in the president also remains very high. I think we have reason to believe that more people are trusting Putin than are distrusting him at present. At the same time, we do have evidence that public awareness of the costs of war, and I'm using costs in a very general way to talk about the human toll, the economic toll, and the stress that is creating, that the public costs are increasing, awareness of that is increasing. I think that there is reason to consider that over time, as people feel those costs in a more direct and personal way, that approval of Putin will go down, and consequently trust will go down. But it will have to go down quite a bit for distrust to take over trust. Now, in the second point, public trust in Vladimir Putin is higher than any trust in any other political object. Again, as I just mentioned, I think that the fact that public appeals are showing this increase on the theme of defense, national security, and legality, to me, that's an indicator that people are trusting Putin, that they're expressing their dissatisfaction or their concerns by lodging appeals. Additionally, when we talk about that increase in protests that I shared in the beginning, one of the things that's really interesting is we're seeing an increase in protest behavior in territories that have typically been more quiescent to Putin, right? So not necessarily just protests in major cities, but protests in the national republics. And obviously this correlates, these are the same regions that felt immediately the partial mobilization, and these are responses to that. Something that's really interesting, though, to think about is that these are protests that are being levied at the regional and the local level. And that creates this really wonderful opportunity for Putin to use that as a foil, right? So, and he's even made comments to the effect of, I realize that it appears, I've heard complaints that there have been mistakes with this partial mobilization. We are going to look into this and rectify this, right? This gives him the opportunity to actually save face and blame local and regional elites for mishaps, and look like the honorable czar who should be petitioned because he's looking out for the people. And my third criterion, I said, my third condition, no credible to Putin alternative to Putin emerges. And as the data I showed you earlier shows, we see a bit of a vacuum in terms of leadership, right? There's no other significant public figures that are mentioned by a significant share of the population. Yet at the same time, a significant share of the population is willing to say that they don't trust anyone. And so that I do think that puts Putin in a vulnerable position. if we think about sort of broader implications from comparative politics, we know that if the resources to co-opt or coerce members of the inner circle of the elite or the mass public for that matter becomes scarce in a personalistic dictatorship like Russia, that dictator becomes vulnerable to defections from the regime elite. So that's something that I think we don't see evidence of who that could be, but I think that is a possibility that we want to be attuned to down the road. And that's my conclusion. I did draw a lot from my previous research in this presentation, so I'm just going to leave up this slide with some of the citations that I use in case any of you are interested in more detail. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.